Hello and welcome to everybody who's tuned in and watching this presentation. My name is Dena Arya and I'm a first year PhD student at Nottingham Trent University in the Department of Politics and International Relations. My research looks at the role that economic inequality plays in how young people participate in environmental politics in the UK. And I'm going to cover in this presentation today why this is even an important thing to be researching, and in so doing talking to you a little bit about my research aims and also how I envisage contributing to existing knowledge. I'll also talk you through how I'm doing this research and explain a bit about my research design and spend the crux of the presentation talking to you about what I do already know, having carried out a pilot phase of my data collection. And the aim of this presentation is really to share these initial findings with you in the hope that I can start dialogue with other PhD researchers who may be exploring similar themes and also getting your feedback and recommendations on how to use these findings to shape and form the next phase of data collection. So, my research aims are to explore how young people from different positions across the spectrum of economic inequality experience participation in environmental politics, and also how they perceive political responses to environmental concern using the concept of the 3 R's, which are resist and reject, reform, and radical change. And this comes from the field of environmental politics. I'll be speaking a little bit more about that down the line. I'd also like to contribute to existing theoretical understandings and explanations of young people's participation in environmental political action. So, environmental politics is witnessing a resurgence of popularity across both the global north and south, and this has been seen to be a predominantly progressive, youth-led and left-wing resurgence. However, not all young people are engaging from the same left-wing position or from a left-wing position, and nor do they all have the same level of access to environmental political action. As this is an emerging social phenomenon, more empirical research is needed to gain insight into how young people are getting involved in environmental politics and the role that economic inequality plays in this. So what do we already know? Well, global economic inequality has been on the rise since before the global financial crash of 2008. And the UK is now one of the most unequal countries in Europe, relating to OECD figures from 2019. More generally, scholarship on economic inequality is growing and points to a threat to liberal democracies. But you may ask, why am I looking at economic inequality when there are so many inequalities that young people experience, be that gender, race, or any of the others that they experience across a multiple axes? Well, some claim that middle-class young people with higher levels of education are more likely to engage in post-material issues such as environmental concerns. However, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can also develop feelings of mistrust and rejection of political institutions, which can drive them to attempt to shift the skewed divisions of power. But there isn't a clear consensus for the reason behind why economic inequality is able to mobilize some whilst demobilizing others. And using the lens of economic inequality, I want to look at young people's political responses to social change. What I mean by resist, reject, reform, and radical change, I'll explain a little bit now. Those who resist and reject can be seen as those who don't recognize that there's an environmental crisis or are unaware that there is an environmental crisis. Reformers would, on the other hand, advocate for market-based solutions to address environmental challenges. And radicals instead seek to shift fundamentally the socio-political and economic system. And while some young people may appear to be radical or using disruptive political action, this does require further investigation. And how am I contributing to wider knowledge? Well, There's a growing scholarship in young people's political participation across Western democracies, and until recently, this interest has been really focused on youth disengagement from electoral politics. There is, however, now an emerging indication that actually young people are not disengaged or uninterested in politics, but they actually develop and are developing innovative and creative ways to participate, be that in environmental action or other political spaces. There is, however, less of a focus on what motivates and drives this kind of behaviour, and this is something that Hay wrote about back in 2007, which still holds true today, and that's something that I seek to contribute to with my research. Looking very briefly at my research design, I'm using a multi-method qualitative approach, and I'm using in sequential order ethnography, semi-structured interviews and focus groups, and ahead of this have carried out a pilot study of 3 focus groups and 2 scoping discussions, and I'll be discussing the focus group findings in this presentation. Throughout my research, I'm also using visual methods, so that means photos and artifacts that I collect myself, and visual media that my participants would create, as well as using existing images and videos such as that, as I would find online. And all of the photographs and drawings and images that you see today in this presentation have been collected either by myself or by my participants. And the reason for using visual methods is to give young people a feeling of agency in the research process, to incorporate the data into the analysis phase, and hopefully to encourage and stimulate conversations, particularly in the interview and focus group stages. So looking quickly at my data collection location sites, well, there are 3 typologies that have been selected to conceptualize political participation, and whilst there's a wealth of literature available on the conception of political participation, I decided to use Ekman and Amner's typologies, which are electoral, and by that I would be looking to find young people who are either members of political parties or youth councils, alternative political participation, such as demonstrations and activist groups, for example, Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, or standby, by which I mean non-political young people who are either passively or actively non-political, and pre-political young people, such as those who volunteer and who could be more easily politicized. And these conceptualizations frame the methodological justifications for the data locations that I've selected. But of course, this really depends on the type of activities that I find young people engaging in. During the pandemic, for example, with data collection moving online, that's meant having to renegotiate some of the research design that I'd set out at the start. So who's being researched? Well, the units of analysis for this research will be young people from higher and lower socioeconomic status, and that is seen as a spectrum. And for the purposes of this research, young people will be self-identifying. Therefore, the concept of young person, for me in this research, will be dependent on who considers themselves to be a young person. So to move on now to my pilot phase and the focus groups that I ran, I carried out 3 focus groups with 33 young people aged between 16 and 21. One was with a state school, one with a private school, and one with the volunteer group, within which all of them had attended state schools. All of these 3 groups were based in London, and none of them considered themselves to be environmental activists, and so very much fell into the standby typology that I discussed previously. I carried out thematic analysis and used a mix of NVivo 12 and hand coding. And through 3 waves of coding, I ended up with 221 codes that I wrote out on pieces of paper and cut up, as you can see in the picture here, and organized those into 11 major themes. And I looked at frequency as well as content of the themes in my analysis. Technical difficulties already. So there were four major themes that emerged for all of the groups that I ran focus groups with, and that was political participation, which is of no surprise, as political participation was something that I built into the questions for the focus group instrument. They also talked about feelings, challenges, and power. There was also a major distinct theme that emerged for each group, and for the private school group, that was education. Whereas for the volunteer group, inequality came up much more than for the other groups, and for the state school group, consequences came up as a major theme. I won't have time to talk through all of these themes in this presentation, but I will be touching on some of the key findings from political participation, challenges, and power in terms of the major concurrent four themes that all groups brought up. And then I'll be honing in on inequality that came up for the volunteer group more so than the other groups. So in terms of electoral participation, the general consensus amongst all of the groups seemed to be that of cynicism and skepticism about this form of political participation. An example of such a discussion with private school young people was that when they were told they weren't allowed to go to the climate strikes, the teachers gave them the option of writing a letter to their MPs instead on the Friday when they should have been going on strike. And one participant says, "It was like, write a letter, send it off. They're going to fix it all. And at the end of the day, you can throw a letter in the bin, but you can't get rid of footage of hundreds of students protesting." And this was very interesting in light of the way in which many of the young people in the private school group spoke about alternative political participation. And many of them saw environmental activism such as climate strikes as something quite positive that they wanted to get involved in. And a majority of them saw that the biggest barrier to their involvement in such actions were education pressures and the adults in their lives giving them permission, particular parents and teachers. However, a majority of the state school and volunteer group were instead quite skeptical about the climate strikes and were much less driven to get involved. One participant in the volunteer group saying, "I don't think they're worth it. I also think a lot of people go on them for fun or for a day off," to which a lot of the group agreed. In terms of standby political participation, all the groups saw individual behaviour change as something positive that they all engaged in, be it eating less red meat, being vegan, recycling, and those kinds of actions. However, on the whole, many saw that as ineffective as the only method of approaching the solutions to the environmental crisis. In particular, the volunteer and state school groups appeared majoritively to be quite skeptical of environmental consumerism, which they saw as a trend, with one young person saying, "Yes, you can say, oh, they're helping the environment, but in a way, it's not their intention to help the environment, but to join what's it called, a trend." And they forgot the whole thing about saving the turtles, and then everyone just started focusing on what to buy. And this continued on with both the state school and volunteer group raising concerns about consumerism as a way in which to address environmental issues. Moving on to the theme of power, none of the groups felt that they had much power to make change, and majoritively saw power as being concentrated. For the volunteer and state school groups, most of them felt that power rested with corporations and economic powers. But for a majority of the private school group, power existed instead with political institutions. They also, on the whole, in the private school group, recognised that their own power came from collective radical action, yet they didn't see the climate strikes as radical enough, which was quite an interesting thing to hear. Now, in terms of challenges, the private school young people mostly spoke about challenges to their own participation in climate strikes, for example, and also challenges to the natural world resulting from the environmental crisis, for example, the extinction of animals. However, the state support group and volunteer groups, on the whole, spoke more about their distrust of corporations and economic institutions and seeing the challenge of capitalism and racial inequality with regards to the environmental crisis as being more imperative challenges to focus on. With one young participant in the volunteer group saying, "We live in a capitalist system, and this is the effect of what will be happening under that. I'm not a communist or anything, but this is capitalism." Economic inequality was a much greater theme for the young people in the volunteer group than any of the other groups, and they spoke not only about economic inequality, but also about geopolitical and the social dimensions of inequality. And whilst the state school young people also expressed some of these themes, it was to a much lesser extent. And the private school participants gave very little space to discussion on this topic. For the volunteer group, much of that discussion around economic inequality was framed around capitalism and the effect of affluent countries on less affluent countries, particularly in the global south. And much less was their focus on the economic inequalities that impacted their own engagement in environmental politics, but more so externally to how the crisis was being perpetuated. So, what were some of the key takeaways from the discussions I had through these focus groups? Well, it was very important to the young people that I spoke to on the whole that all kinds of young people should be spoken to, and not just environmental activists. That's something that they spoke a lot about, but also emerged from the kinds of discussions that I was having. They also felt that they should be explicitly asked about the role of economic inequality on their participation, and this was a very big learning for me, as prior to these focus groups I had decided to make this section implicit and not ask any direct questions about economic inequality, but through the discussions that clearly brought up this theme and also the discussions with the young people, it became apparent that this is something that needs to be brought to the fore and made much more explicit in order to get a richer takeaway from it all. Visual media was very useful in probing young people and their thoughts, and it was quite positive to see that having the visual research element in the methodology is something that's going to provide a richer discussions. There also needs to be a bigger focus on questions around political responses. There wasn't a lot of discussion around radical, reformist or rejection change. And this would be something that I need to work on. So any hints or ideas on kinds of questions that I could potentially be asking around that would be really welcomed. Also, they felt that questions relating to concerns, barriers, and solutions to the environmental crisis were really important, and so would be put into the instruments for the interview phase of this research. So the next phase will be the interviews, and I'm in the process of building instruments for that. And I really look forward to any feedback at all on what I've been talking about, or if you'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about any of these themes, it would be great to have that discussion. Just also like to take a moment to say thank you to everybody at the PSA who arranged this virtual conference. It's been a shame for a lot of us to have had conferences cancelled where we were presenting this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been brilliant to have the opportunity to present in this format today, so thank you very much. And those are my references in case you want to pause your screen and take a look at any of the references that I've been discussing here today. And that's all from me. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.